All right, it is just about 12:15, so I am going to go ahead and get started. So today I am going to be both your host and your presenter. So it's a little bit of a different setup for me as well, but I think it will go okay. So as a reminder, if you have not heard it yet before, this is a collaboration between three universities. So that's Masood Hashemi at the University of Massachusetts, Rick Kersbergen at the University of Maine, and Heather Darby at the University of Vermont. And the three of them are on a Northeast SARE grant studying different forms of season extension and alternative forage production strategies. So if any of these strategies that we have talked about are of interest to you, whether it be what we talk about today with grazing our winter cover crops, whether it be about grazing summer annuals or stockpiling, there are some farmer stipends in that grant. And if you're interested, please get in touch with me and I can put you in touch with Masood or one of his collaborators if you'd like to do some of this work on your own farm. I'd also like to make sure I point out the Cedar Tree Foundation has funded the newly formed New England Grazing Network. So while I work at UMass full-time, I also work with the Livestock Institute, who is a partner of the New England Grazing Network, as a project coordinator for Mass, New England, and Connecticut. And so both the Livestock Institute and UMass are supporting my time today as both a presenter and a host. So thank you to them. For the New England Grazing Network, you can find us on our website, on Facebook, or on Instagram, and there's many other educational opportunities, networking events, so on and so forth, posted at those locations. Great, so let's get right into it. So today we're talking about harvesting your winter cover crop for forage. And this background picture is actually a study that we did for 2 years on a dairy farm in Massachusetts, where we took this project off of the research farm and took it on farm. We actually tested it at 3 different farms to get some broader and more applied results. So just to start, I want to make it clear that today we're going to be talking about rye, wheat, and triticale. Triticale being a hybrid of wheat and rye, which are 2 different species. So the breeding of triticale is actually pretty complex. But each one of these plants has their own personality, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more detail today. And you really should pick a plant that you want to work with. It's like if you could pick a coworker, pick someone whose work style is going to match and complement your own. And I've worked with all of these different plants. This was what I did my graduate research on, and so I worked with all of these plants over 5 years and gotten to really know some of the nuances of their different behavior. Now, one of the biggest things that people said they were interested in the registration question was, I want to know, what is the difference between this being a cover crop and a forage crop? Or how do I take my cover crop and turn it into a forage crop? And the simplest answer to that is you harvest it, right? That's the big change. Is a cover crop is typically grown to be it's not a cash crop. It's grown that you're going to reincorporate it to the soil, and you're growing it for different ecosystem services. Whereas a forage crop we think of as more of a cash crop. But as soon as you've harvested your cover crop, you've still gotten those cover crop benefits, but now you've added this benefit of being able to use it for forage for your animals. But now to make it, truly a successful and valuable harvest, the big thing is timing. And that's going to be first when you plant we always say fall, but it's really the late summer when we're planting in September, and we'll talk about that in detail. And then also when you harvest. Like any forage crop, like any pasture, like any hay, you really need to be on it by boot stage. If you let it go beyond that, especially with things like rye, they will lose their feed quality fast. And so you really have to treat these like a crop that you plan to get a value from. The other important thing is the variety selection. So there's, you can go down to the local farmers co-op, you can get a VNS, variety not stated, bunch of rye to go plant as a cover crop. That's not going to have the quality that you're going to be looking for a forage variety. So talking to your seed supplier, talking to your co-op, whoever you're buying your seed from, definitely ask about or look into the forage varieties that you might want to be using. I also want to point out that this really is not a new idea. So when I worked on this project, over 5 or 6 years, I worked with dairy farmers. And there's one generation that says, oh, you're trying this again, and then there's another generation that says, what do you mean you want me to go out and plant my cover crop on September 1st and harvest it for forage? So I found this fun article that's actually from Nature, which is a very famous scientific publication from 1889. And to give you some context, basically someone wrote a book on forage, and these authors have written in and said, hey, nice book, but and I've underlined here in red, they say, an agriculturalist would be somewhat surprised to find that in this work, dealing with the best forage crops, that they made no mention of what we consider as the best fodder crops. And then they list a few of these best crops, one of them being winter rye. So again, this is from 1889, and they're saying, hey, winter rye is one of our best fodder crops. How are you missing that? So this really is not a new idea, but it's something that we're studying more. We have a lot more breeding, and so it's gaining a lot of resurgence and interest. I'd also like to point out that there is a similar concept used in grain production, such as in Oklahoma. There's a lot of work being done on this, or that has been done, where the late winter to early spring growth in wheat is harvested, and then the plant is allowed to regrow, and that regrowth is used for grain production in June. So this is not a new idea, but it is one that we want to look at bringing back into action and getting more forage production out of our land. So the question that comes up, or has come up in all of our presentations so far in this series, is, where does this fit in my rotation? So for this particular strategy, we're going to be talking about planting in September. Sometime between the 1st and the 15th is ideal. And then you're going to be harvesting in May when it reaches boot stage. And that's going to vary a little bit between rye, wheat, and triticale. But for general planning purposes, you can assume mid-May. And so I usually work with this with dairy farmers because it fits really comfortably after corn silage, but it is a tight time squeeze after corn harvest if a longer season corn is being used. So that's one place where we very commonly see this practice, but it turns out it also fits really well after sweet corn production because that sweet corn comes off earlier, sometime usually by the end of August, and then you're able to get these nice planting dates. However, this is something that we've also used for farmers, and we did this on farm, which is this picture at the right, for transitioning land to pasture. And in this particular case with this on-farm study, it was a field, on a rock shelf, high elevation, had not been reseeded probably for decades, and needed a little love. And so the farmer went through, brush hogged, did some basic preparation. And then we used triticale, so he was still able to graze that land, still able to get a benefit, but was getting weed suppression and was getting the soil ready to be reseeded back into a perennial pasture. So if you're someone that's transitioning land, that might make sense for you. Now also, I know a lot of people that are on today have all available land in hay and perennial pasture, and that's great. And so if you're already saying, hey, I don't see where this fits in terms of my land or my timing, I would strongly encourage you to consider a field share with your neighbors. We do see that more commonly in the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts. There's a lot of mid-sized farms. There's a lot of land swapping in order to facilitate good rotation. There's also a lot of dairy farmers. And I hear dairy farmers saying, man, I see my neighbor, they're an organic vegetable producer. They have this field of alfalfa and transition land. What do I got to do in order to get access to that land? Likewise, if you're a 100% grazing operation and you have a dairy farmer neighbor and they plant a cover crop and they're not going to harvest it for forage, don't hesitate to say, hey, could I harvest that? Could I bale that off of there and use it for forage? So something I also want to point out up front, again, a question that has come up often when we talk about grazing annuals or harvesting annuals is, should you have a field set aside that we would recommend to keep an annual production? And I would say the answer to that is no. I'm not recommending that you sacrifice your pasture land in order to accommodate these annuals. Rather, I'm saying find space in your own rotation, find space in a neighbor's rotation if you're looking for additional feed to try this practice. It can also be a great way to help repair let's say you had an overwintering field last year, you're going to have a different overwintering field this year. It can be a way to help repair those fields that have been a little beat up or have been used to sacrifice areas. So in terms of the actual planting, if you're going to be harvesting mechanically, 110 pounds an acre seeding rate for all three works pretty well. But you might want to go closer towards 150 pounds per acre if you're hoping to use this for fall grazing so that you have more biomass out there. And also in general, if you're going to be broadcasting your seed, again, boost that seeding rate to make sure you get a good stand. So you can see here, this has been planted with a drill. It looks a little patchy because it is a research experiment, but seeding with the Brilliant works really well. That's what we did at that farm that was transitioning pasture. And what we did at that dairy farm from that first picture is all he did was harvest his corn silage, and then he went out there with the fertilizer spreader attached to the back of the tractor, and he broadcast seed, and then he came back through with a roll bar, and it did a really great job. He had excellent stand establishment. I mean, better than you would expect. So as far as cover crops go, yes, these still need good seed to soil contact, but these are really forgiving. I mean, these are the workhorses of our forage and cover crop world. So I also think these are a great beginner alternative forage because of their ease of management. So here are your different harvesting options. So one option is fall grazing. And if you're going to graze in the fall planting date is absolutely critical. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about planting date in just a second here. But same goes for a spring graze or harvest. There's a little bit more forgiveness in your planting date, but up to a point. And so I want to spend a few minutes talking about this graph. And I know it's not a very exciting slide to look at, but there's a lot of information here that I think is really important. So I want to start by getting you oriented. I'm going to find my little drawing tool here. Great. So what you're looking at is basically how much yield you are getting. So the blue line is the spring harvest. Now all of these dates all of these yields are harvested at the same date. So these are all harvested mid-May. The difference is when they were planted. So in the spring, if crops were planted on September 1st, in the spring and mid-May, you get about 2,200 pounds of dry matter per acre. On the same date in the spring, if you had planted them 2 weeks later on September 15th, you're still getting about 2,200 pounds of dry matter. But if you had planted in the spring on September 30th, if you planted in the fall on September 30th, then come spring, you're getting closer to 1,700 pounds of dry matter. So same concept, the gray line is your fall harvest. So if you planted on September 1st and you were harvesting this is usually early mid-November, you're looking at about 1,500 pounds of dry matter. And this is where fall planting day becomes important. If you had waited until September 15th and you're hoping to graze this in the fall, now you're looking at, just a little over 1,000 pounds of dry matter. But if you had delayed until September 30th, then in the fall, you're not grazing this. You have like 200 pounds of dry matter. So you have very little out there. So there's a couple of points that I want to make about this. Let's see if it'll let me advance my slide here. Bear with me. There we go. So here's the first point that I want to make. The first point is, if you had seen me present about this, at really any point over the past 5 years, I would have told you with confidence that September 1st was when we really needed to be planting these crops by in order to get a good yield. And that was true. I mean, that was true according to all of the research that we've had. But it seems that, and it's likely due to climate change, we can actually plant now a little bit later than we used to think. Now, this is true for Massachusetts, and so it might also be true for your region, but keep in mind where this was done. And so you see, if you plant on September 1st or you plant on September 15th, well, in the spring, you're getting the same amount of dry matter production. And so that makes it a little bit easier for your planting schedule because, that gives you about 2 weeks from now before you need to be thinking, okay, I really need to get out there and plant. And what's happening is both plants are essentially getting enough time to prepare healthy crowns, which is the growth restructure or the regrowth structure. So they're getting enough time before they go into winter dormancy in order to be successful in the spring. But then the next point is, in this spring harvest, if you delay planting until the end of September, you are going to see a yield penalty in the spring, about 500 pounds per acre of dry matter. So you're still getting a reasonable harvest, but what this really shows you is planting late should not be the plan. It should not be plan A. Always shoot for that earlier planting. You can get away with the 15th, but somewhere between the 15th and the end of September, things are going to start to go south on you. And so this is, again, the difference between a cover crop and a forage crop. The fall, there's a few interesting things here. So it's pretty clear in the fall, yes, if you delay planting, you are going to get less yield, very obvious. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. And so here's another big point. If you delay from September 1st to September 15th, you have a 20% yield reduction. But if you delay from the 15th to the 30th, you have an 82% yield reduction in the fall. So one thing that's happening here is those later planted plants, those September 30th plants, they really just do not have enough time. It's all they can do to get their leaves up, to do some photosynthesis, and then they're saying, oh my gosh, I need to make a healthy crown so that I can survive the winter. And because of that, you are seeing that manifest in your later spring yields. And so, some people say, well, it's just growing degree days. It must have been, a warmer earlier part of the season. So I want to make sure also it's clear that this data is an average of 4 years of data. So in this data, we've captured wet years, dry years, warm years, cold years. This is the average trend if you do this practice regularly. And so I'll tell you why it's not growing degree days. And I'm just going to make one more slide and then I'll get off of this point. Between that September 1st and that September 15th, for us, on an average, there's 400 growing degree days. Between September 15th and September 30th, on average, there's 340 growing degree days. So they're very comparable. And so what's really happening is it's not these changes in growing degree days, it's changes to light quality, and that's angle and intensity. And this is just something that you can't overcome, right? You can hope for a warm winter, you can hope for a warm fall, you can hope for good growing conditions, but plants get these cues to go into winter dormancy from both temperature as well as light. And so you can have a great fall, but they're still saying, oh, the light's changing, the angle is different, I can't do as much photosynthesis. And so they're still going to get those messages that it's time to get ready for winter. And so this is why it's so important to prioritize planting date, because you just can't fight the biology. And there's always an exception to the rule. I mean, there are people that will plant in October and some magic happens and they get a great stand in the spring. But again, your plan should not be to count on magic. Your plan should be to consider this biology and make sure you're paying attention to planting date. I'm spending a lot of time on it because it is so important to make the difference between your cover crop and your forage crop. Great. So I got started on this whole bit about planting date because of harvest options. So let's go back to harvest options. And again, here on the right, it's not a great photo, but this is a photo of cows at that farm where we did some pasture renovation grazing on triticale. Don't count on spring regrowth worthy of a harvest if you fall graze. You might get some regrowth, you're still going to get some cover crop benefits, but don't plan on going out there and harvesting or baling again. Again, it's not impossible. We don't have a lot of good data on it, and these plants are a little bit more susceptible to being damaged and then not recovering well in the spring. but that's fine, right? If your need is to extend your fall grazing season. And of course, always take into consideration where you're picking these fields, the logistics of getting the animals to the forage. I mean, maybe, you have a field behind the barn that's going to be your sacrifice area anyways. And so you seed that down and you say, hey, let them graze it as long as they can, and then I'll overwinter them there. So that could be a creative solution for you. For spring grazing or harvesting, again, as we mentioned, there's more forgiveness. You can get away with September 15th, depending on your needs. September 30th, a little bit less yield than the spring, but maybe enough to be worth it to you. But again, pay very careful attention here to the fields that you choose and the species that you choose. So are the fields in the spring in mid-May, it's a problem for us around here, are they going to be too wet to put your animals on to graze in May? Or are they going to be too wet to harvest mechanically? And with these crops, you're never making dry hay. You're only making baleage, or you can, ensile them under a tarp. That's fine. But that can be a challenge. And if you're not going to be able to get into these fields where you have them and they're maturing quickly, you might end up having your feed quality really go down. We'll talk a little bit more again about the 3 different species, rye, wheat, and triticale, and why you might choose one or the other to accommodate for things like wet fields. But now, again, if it's a field, maybe you don't want to put your animals out on a perennial pasture because they're going to beat them up in the spring, it's too wet, but maybe you choose to use this method so you can put them out, let them graze. It's something you're going to plant with annuals anyways. Maybe you're going to do squash or sweet corn. And so this could also be a way to spare your perennial pastures if you want to get them out grazing and you have a problem with wetness. Think of it like a spring sacrifice area. Again, good for stored feed, good for wrapped bales. It does just fine. We had a dairy farmer do this, another dairy farmer on 40 acres with triticale, and just classic under the white tarp, under tires, made great silage for them. And again, we're going to be looking at harvesting these in the boot stage. And so that's, if you can see a seed head or you see flowering starting, you've gone too late. And things like rye can really get away from you quickly. Things like wheat mature more slowly. So you definitely need to do a little scouting to make sure that you're harvesting these in the boot stage. That's when you're going to get both the best yield and the best feed quality. After boot stage, these plants lose their feed quality very quickly. So I alluded to this before. This is where these personalities start to come in. So with rye, for example, I'm a huge fan of Wheeler rye. It is just amazing. It grows so tall. It's just a huge yielder. So if you're looking for a forage variety to start out with, I would strongly recommend Wheeler rye. It is ready first. So you might be looking at the second week of May. I mean, it can come on pretty quickly. It's very reliable. All rye in general overwinters. Shows a lot of tolerance to freeze thaw cycles that are becoming more common in New England due to warmer spring events and then going back to freezing events that can kill other plants, but rye has a little bit more tolerance for that. One of the highest yielders consistently, but this is not going to work out for you if you have wet fields or you are really busy in the spring and you're not going to be able to get on it because it will mature and then it will not be any good to you. So full disclosure, it is very average feed quality and protein. You're not going to be getting animal weight gains on this, but it is a way to get early fresh forage production. So on the right here, there's 2 tables. One is for, and I'm going to leave them up for the next couple slides if you're looking at them. So this is from 4 years of research that we did at the UMass Research Farm in Sunderland, Deerfield, sorry. Worked there for 5 years and I still can't tell you what town it's in. And then this is an on-farm experiment with the dairy farm just over the Connecticut River from the research farm, which is in Sunderland. So we use the same variety of rye at both places, Wheeler. at the Deerfield experiment, we have Arapahoe wheat that is a forage variety. We used Emerson wheat at the dairy farm, again, a forage variety. And then you'll see here we used the same triticale variety, but one would happen to be organic, the other one was not. It just really had to do with the availability of seed when we did this. And then at the dairy farm, we used 2 other triticale varieties in addition. One was one of the trical varieties, and then one was just, a VNS. It was organic. Something that we found with the triticales is some challenges in seed availability, and so these really reflected at the time what we could get our hands on. But it's better now. A lot more interest in triticale has made the seeds more widely available. So anyways, with all that context, what you can see from this is rye in both locations over, different time frame, consistent yield of 2.1 tons of dry matter. Relative feed value 110, 112. It's not stellar, but it's not bad at all. And then 10.5% crude protein. That would be considered to be average. Again, it's not weight gain feed, but it's maintenance feed. And this might be a little bit of a sore spot, but a point that I do want to make is that this is definitely better than some of the hay that's being bought and sold without forage tests. We test a lot of hay, and it comes back not great. And so if you're buying hay and you're not getting a forage test on it, you would be better off planting rye and harvesting on your farm. And as long as you harvest it in the boot stage, you're in good territory. So this is also a plug. I would encourage you to test these alternative forages at the very least the first year you work with them, when you're sort of learning their personalities. But also in a general plug, always ask for a hay test before you buy anything. So, okay, wheat. I don't have a favorite wheat. But in general, it is a very respectable plant. It does a good job. So what's nice about it is the slowest to mature. And so that might be more conducive to you if you are going to put this in a wet field, or if you just say, I know my spring is nuts and I want something that's going to be more forgiving of my own busyness. And so because wheat matures very slowly, you could be looking at the end of May and it might still be in the tillering stage. It might not even be in boot stage yet. And so I love wheat for that purpose. That being said, it's not a terribly high yielder. It does tend to be the lowest yielder. In one location we got 1.7 tons an average over 4 years. Another location we got 1.3 tons an average over 2 years. So a little bit lower yield, but it does tend to be on the higher end of the crude protein. I mean, this is a small range, but 11% in both locations. And the feed value is higher, 120, 132. And again, that's because it's a younger plant, generally, when you end up harvesting it. So good candidate depending on what your needs are. Another interesting thing is a lot of these forages tend to be, the rye and the triticales tend to be closer to 80% moisture, whereas the wheat actually tends to be closer to 70% moisture. And so if you're grazing this, then you can think, well, there's more dry matter in each bite. So there's a little bit more intake. So, okay, conducive to wet fields, we already said that. Great. So the last is triticale. I'm a big fan of the trical varieties. There's been a lot of recent work and breeding on those in the past couple of years, and so there's a lot of potential for them. I would strongly recommend that you talk to your seed companies for their recommendations, and definitely check the variety trial reports. Heather Darby and her team does a lot of great work on these variety trials for all 3 of these plants. So you can just Google, UVM triticale variety trial, and you'll find them. They're easy to find. And so the idea with triticales, it's supposed to be the best of both worlds. That was the goal of breeding rye with wheat. So the idea is you get rye's winter hardiness and rye's high biomass production, and you combine that with wheat's high protein, good feed value. So some people love triticale, some people think it's kind of maybe it's just average. So, in our results at our research farm, you know, it kind of was average. It didn't quite yield as much as wheat, but it was fine for crude protein and relative feed value. At the dairy farm, we did find that these two varieties, the Trical and the NE412 6GT, did out yield wheat. But then here's this VNS, you know, it's a really low yielder. But again, you know, the feed values fine, but the crude protein was pretty low on these, which we weren't happy to see. And so again, for these reasons, I would check variety trial reports before you choose to plant triticale. It's a totally fine plant, but you know, sometimes you can get by with good old rye. All right, so termination. Glyphosate is really commonly used to terminate all three of these crops. Again, you know, we did a lot of work in dairy silage, and so you can see the residue here where in this particular case, silage was no-till planted into the residue. So what you might want to consider doing if you are going to go with a glyphosate approach is after you harvest or after you graze, allowing for some regrowth so that there's a little bit more plant matter for the herbicide to actually stick to so that you get good termination. It does regrow pretty quickly in the spring, so you don't have to wait more than about a week. The other typical method of termination is tillage. So unfortunately, the residue that is left behind after you harvest is going to be too short for a roller crimper. So right now, you know, we do not have a good no-till and organic recommendation. If you can think of one, I am all ears. Please tell me. I mean, all jokes aside, maybe you put on your neighbor's pigs on the residue and let them till it up if you want something that's, you know, no spray. But again, you're still going to get that soil disturbance. So that is the catch-22 with growing these, is you do have to have a termination plan. They will regrow and with a passion. So very quickly, there were some people that were really interested in this idea of, well, but what about the cover crop benefits to the soil? And am I going to sacrifice those if I harvest this crop? And the answer is no, not at all. So yes, you are going to incorporate less total organic matter than if you return the whole crop. Obviously, right? You've harvested some of it, but the residue that you're returning is still more than the entire organic matter that would be produced by crops like oats or forage radishes or a variety of other cover crop mixtures. So we did actually measure the residue, and there's about 1.6 tons of dry matter per acre in just those 3 inches of stubble alone. So you are still returning a whole lot of organic matter to these soils. So all of that residue is still going to help you sequester carbon. You are still going to build soil organic matter. And harvesting cover crops in this way, it does help with nutrient cycling, especially on dairy farms. It actually helps remove excess phosphorus and nitrogen from histories of manure application. And you are still going to get erosion prevention. And I think we kind of have become comfortable saying erosion prevention and not really thinking about its impact and what that means. So this is a farm that I sampled last spring that had a history of potato production. A dairy farmer that I work with was going to take it over for corn silage production. No cover cropping history. I mean, no good cover cropping history. A lot of tillage. And it just had these crazy washouts. I mean, it was insane to see. And you could actually see them from Google Maps, you know, from Google Earth. You can, you know, see aerially how big these washouts are. So talking about erosion prevention, I just want to bring it back into context. You know, it is a big deal, and you are still going to get that in these systems. You also still get fantastic weed suppression. So you can see a little bit in these are alleyways, and then this is, because this was a research experiment, this is a control plot where nothing was planted. Anywhere that there's not rye, wheat, or triticale is just a carpet of weeds. We have an excellent weed population at the research farm. Anywhere that you have one of these 3 crops, I mean, you honest to God don't see a single weed in the stand. Their weed suppression is phenomenal. They're such strong competitors. I mean, the weeds just can't compete with them. So if you're looking for fall and spring weed suppression, I mean, these are your friends, whether you harvest them or not. You're going to get that still. So quick note on subsequent fertility. Because only 20 to 40% of these cover crop residues will decompose in year 1. That's what we found in no-till systems. what you end up having conditions for what is called nitrogen immobilization. It has to do with the high carbon content. It has to do with the decomposition process. If you're interested, you can send me an email and I'm happy to talk to you about it more at length. People will often say, oh, it's allelopathy. The plants produce chemicals and it prevents other plants from doing well. Well, there's very low evidence of that. There are definitely some varieties of wheat, some of rye that we know make the chemicals that do that. The odds that you're planting one of them is pretty low. So if you see the next crop that you plant isn't doing so great, it's almost certainly a lack of nitrogen because of this high carbon input. So your next fertility, you do need to be planning to put in nitrogen. So last slide, this is a kind of a wild card, but Troy got me thinking of it in our last presentation on stockpiling. We started talking about, what can get us through some of these really dark months where the stockpile is gone. I mean, there's just something to graze. So we haven't tried this, but if it's something that you're interested in, I'll just share this little bit of anecdotal information. So this picture on the left, this is rye on November 21st of 2017. This is after the first snowfall and melt. I mean, but I'm not talking about like a 1-inch snowfall. I'm talking about like we got a couple of inches. And it's great. I mean, it's green. The only thing that's happened is it's flattened down a little bit. So, this could also be a great option if you're trying to delay when you get to your stockpile in the fall. These plants can really put up with some winter snowfall. And then on the right here, this is February 26th of 2018. So same experiment in the spring. And this is one of our first thaw events of the season. So yeah, I mean, you can see some tiller death, but there's still a lot of green underneath them. So these plants really do hold up under the snow. So if you want to be ahead of the curve and you want to try an experiment that we haven't tried yet and try these out for stockpiling, let me know and let me know what you come up with. So food for thought. So with that, we have 8 minutes left, and let me pop into my questions box. I see a couple. Okay, let's see. Do you have a dollar figure on what this extra spring dry matter will cost for you to plant and manage? Yes, and I can send it to you directly. I'll tell you, it's not much. I mean, the investment in, let me say it like this, it's not that expensive of a practice, especially if you're barreling down an acre with a fertilizer spreader. I mean, you can plant really fast. These are cheap seeds, and then you don't have to do anything again until the spring. You do not need to fertilize them. We have tried that. It makes no really difference. These are like as low maintenance as you can go are these crops. So, Troy, I can look for those numbers and send those to you. Thank you for the compliment, Lori. Appreciate it. I don't know if anybody else has any other questions. I'll give you a minute to think about it. Here's the question. Is there much of a price difference between varieties of each forage type? Excellent question. Thank you for asking. Yes, not a huge price difference, but when you start thinking about it over the acres, yeah, it can definitely add up. So your VNS, your variety not stated, they're always tempting because they're super cheap. Stay away from them. They're fine for cover crops. They're a total gamble for forage. The tri-cals are a little bit more expensive, and I think that is because there has been more work on them recently. So I do know people love them and swear by them, and they do pay more for them. But again, talk to your seed supplier, look at your variety reports. I think your forage wheats and your forage rye tend to be pretty comparable. You're not really paying a surcharge because of the forage quality of those. You're just picking one versus another. So, maybe I'm partial. I do love rye. It's cheap, it's easy, and if you can get to it on time, it's just a great beginner, great workhorse. Okay. I don't know if there's any other questions. Wait one more second. If you think of anything afterwards, please go ahead, get in touch with me, send me an email. There was one person that said, oh, can I please get the name and position of the presenter? Yeah, so my name is Sam Corcoran. I do have a PhD. I do work at UMass. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I do also work with the Grazing Institute or the Livestock Institute as both a grazing professional and a plant and soil scientist. So hope that answers your question. Okay, great. So it looks like, Felix, thank you so much for the compliment. I do appreciate it. All right, there are a few minutes left, but it looks like not too many more questions are rolling in. So yes, we will post a copy of this presentation. I'll put up the slides and the recording as well. We have a wonderful undergraduate that does it for us because none of us know how to do it, and our semester has just started. So we have a little bit of a delay. They will go up. I will send everyone an email to let them know that they have gone up. We're also waiting on Troy's as well as Heather Darby's to get posted. Those two should be going up this weekend. So I'll send everyone an email update when that happens. All right. Well, great. Thanks so much, everybody. And you will get a survey at the end when you close out your window. So if you could take that, we definitely appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend.